A pleasure to meet y'all at last. And today, it is March 12th, 2022. And for today, let's just say that alongside a lot of the new content that I have been unveiling left and right, this whole year is going to be a pretty big boatload of business relating to content production and providing. Because starting today, if you remember, well, that exact spot over there, that big chair that sits on the corner of this here living room, this is basically where I have typically made films I should have talked about years ago related content. But starting today and going all the way until around maybe May pretty much, I will in fact be steering away from all that, instead trying something a little bit different. Because this is the time where I could probably go off on a different tangent. This is not films I should have talked about years ago, season 2. Even though I've said in a vlog at one point earlier this year that that is what I will be focusing on this year. Instead, it's a new tangent in which I will be revisiting certain films that I've watched throughout the past 20 years of my life. Or could I just say, throughout my entire life. But mainly in the past 20, because I've had VHS back then at the time. I eventually got a hold of DVDs, and then I got a hold of the internet. This is films I'm willing to talk about again. And for the record, yes, this does in fact include a lot of films that you probably do remember me talking about back in the day on YouTube, especially in the past 15 years almost that this channel's been around for. And so, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin by talking about one Pixar film called Finding Nemo. Yeah, it's pretty much going to follow the same formula where the poster is going to be revealed on the side of the screen here to let you know exactly what film I'll be talking about, akin to that of the title down below. But in any case, let's just get started here. I've mentioned before that Finding Nemo was a pretty special point in Pixar's lifespan. And considering the fact that it does pay a lot of memoriam to Steve McQueen, who was a big producer working with the company at the time, and the fact that Steve Jobs was even the official CEO of the company, the same guy who was also in charge of Apple was also in charge of Pixar back in the day. But nowadays, Chief Executive Officer does apply to a good handful of other people as the years went on. But Finding Nemo was a point in time where we got to see a lot of things unfold. As Pixar's experience with CGI grew, so did a lot of their treatment. They managed to get bigger and better as the years went on. As they progressed through the 2000s, the 2010s, and even up until today, here in the early 2020s, a pretty harsh time to be in. But we are still optimistic about what the future has in store for us this whole decade. Finding Nemo, on the other hand, though, was a really good example out there. This is in fact the story of a large group of fish down in the ocean. It's not necessarily highlighted very well, but yet there are a lot of people out there with wild theories about where this actually takes place in. But regardless of what people might think about the setting here, the whole point of Finding Nemo was in fact the story of finding someone's way back home. That's pretty much just the premise of this whole entire thing. You have a clownfish called Marlin, whom was voiced by actor Albert Brooks. And of course, Albert Brooks, aside from being well known in a majority of other films out there, eventually becoming a part of The Simpsons, as I recall back then. Maybe I'll get to that some other time. But Finding Nemo at the time was the best Albert Brooks film I might have ever gotten to know about. But this film also stars Ellen DeGeneres, whom we've definitely known as the years went on. Probably the best I've gotten to know Ellen was based on an original game show called Ellen's Game of Games. But yet, maybe not everybody is going to be all excited to see Ellen DeGeneres considering what has been happening throughout the past 3 years. But here in 2022, we should not ever fear about what the past had brought us, because They say that the future is bright, no matter what happens. And Finding Nemo does do a lot more than just show us the simple premise within the plotline of how one little clownfish goes missing. Because the whole thing about this is that it started off not too well. Marlin was in fact mated to another clownfish out there called Coral, whom of course gets attacked by a large swordfish. And unfortunately, this kind of fish was not very bright. But then of course what eventually happens is that after Marlin gets knocked unconscious, it apparently turns out Coral got killed, and just about every single egg that they had laid had been destroyed, all except one. And when it hatched, it turned out to be another little clownfish who was called Nemo. And Marlin, still traumatized by these events, tries as hard as possible to not allow Nemo to go venture out into the open ocean where a lot of dangers could be lying around. And it pretty much makes sense because a lot of people back in the day certainly had a lot more concern about how their children were to go out into the world to interact with life as it was back in the day. And it really goes to show that compared to how today's lifestyle is, life back then was a million times worse because we did not have everything that we ever had today. And on top of all that, compared to how today's technology is, it's pretty hard to monitor most kids. And sure, even into the 2000s, people tried their hardest to come up with some good parenting techniques, many which had failed. But when you really think about how Finding Nemo turns out, it really gives us a greater example of how an interaction between a parent and a child should truly turn out to be. But instead, it gives us a different kind of direction based on a relationship that happens between parents and children. Because what happens is that Nemo eventually goes out into the open ocean while trying to attend a school, accompanied by a giant manta ray known as Mr. Ray. And Nemo eventually comes across a boat that's out there in the open ocean, and eventually just goes and taps underneath it. Marlin gets angry, but then eventually the real trouble begins to brew because a diver ends up coming up and then captures Nemo and then speeds off away, taking the boat with. Marlin is unable to catch up and ends up requesting for help to go try to find Nemo at any cost, eventually bumping into a large tang fish called Dory. And this is pretty much where it gets important right here, because the sort of relationship that we get to see here between a clownfish who's scared of seeing a children possibly killed, just like what had happened back then, and then of course you have a blue tang whom unfortunately suffers from the combination of short-term memory loss as well as constant irritation. And this is where we can greatly see Albert Brooks' interpretation of a clownfish. Because the way I see it, especially, even to this day, it sure is, in fact, quite a story. Because eventually Nemo gets taken over to a dentist's office where he's then introduced to a large group of fish inside of a tank. They eventually start formulating plans here and there, and a lot of things begin to happen that really gives a plot the way that its money is totally worth. Eventually it gets down to the point where we encounter what is known as the main antagonist of the film, who is known as Darla, a child with braces, whom is also the daughter of the dentist over there, known as P. Sherman. And this is of course where we eventually get to know about how Marlin and Dory try to find Nemo in the best way possible. They hitch a ride on a group of sea turtles, and then we get to see them go into the very deep, dark portion of the abyss, where they encounter a large angler, and then eventually they get down to some really intense stuff. Eventually, when they start traveling out towards land, they find a flock of seagulls, and the seagulls try to get out to the dentist's office, where Nemo is currently held at. And that, of course, is where the real conflict starts to brew. The fact that Marlin and Dory tug on the gull's tongue, causing it to go flock around in the entire office, and then Darla just lets go of Nemo, who was able to escape thanks to, the filtration system, which is primarily used as a way to dispose of the waste that the patients spit out after having their mouths rinsed. Because back in the day, that's pretty much how it worked. But in any case, Nemo was able to escape the dentist's office and eventually head back out into the open ocean after crossing through a lot of sewage, which is quite disgusting. But when you really get down to it, this is how Nemo was able to escape the lair of the main antagonists. And then, of course, it eventually goes down to a point where a fishing trawl ends up catching Dory and Nemo. And then Marlin goes and tries to get the fish to swim out of there. And this is where we really see an epic climax. I've even had a meetup with a therapist at one point who showed me this exact clip where the fishing trawl has in fact caught a bunch of fish, including Dory and Nemo, and they both have to fight their way out of it before they suffocate due to a loss of water. So this is, of course, where the ultimate ending to your CGI film really comes in. Because I've certainly mentioned this before. The whole point of this film was to give us a good glimpse as to how a parent and a child should interact with one another. And it certainly gives us that kind of vibe that we have gotten from many other film franchises, including Stuart Little and Toy Story, for the most part. But we are in fact going to be seeing a lot more cliches similar to this, and tropes of all kinds take on this sort of manner. Because Finding Nemo was an enormous box office success when it premiered in May 2003. And looking at it now, nearly 20 years later, I really ought to say that it has a lot of connectivity to how Pixar should truly make their films. And with the many other franchises that Pixar had started, looking at how many billion-dollar successes that we've gotten right now, it's hard to imagine having a life without a constant co-creation done by such a professional grouping like Pixar that we probably wouldn't ever know what CGI would have ever been like if it weren't for their first masterpiece in 1995, Toy Story. And for the record, there's a lot of Pixar films that I might as well talk about again at some point. But coming soon, I will in fact be taking a little bit of a clear and steer from Pixar for the time being, and move on to one of their competitors that was in fact started by a former Disney executive known as DreamWorks.